We'll be reading 16 through 33. Long text. Follow along. Here we go, guys. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole city for their sake. Abraham answered and said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And again he spoke to him and said, Suppose 40 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 40 I will not do it. Then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 20 I will not destroy it. And then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way, and when he finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So the world can be a pretty scary place. For those of us who are not blind to much of the violence and the wickedness and the evil that exists in the world can be pretty scary. We live in South Texas. We live where there's border violence. Spillover violence is a very real thing. Okay, I've driven down 83 when cops are chasing this truck, and he's going the wrong way down the expressway. Okay, apparently he had 900 pounds of drugs, and he had 20 cops and a helicopter chasing him. Okay, and he zipped right past me. He must have been doing 90 or 100. I missed him probably by about 4 feet when I had to switch lanes. Okay, local gang violence, cartel violence, all that is very real down here. Gang violence, gang activity, gang initiations, all that stuff is pretty normal. It can be really scary down here. It's been reported that there have been more casualties related to border violence than in the war in the Middle East since it has started. Terrorism by Islamic radicals is still very real. People getting into and trying to get into public places with weapons is very fresh and very real in the minds of people in Aurora, Colorado, and even in Ohio shortly after that. Sex trafficking, slavery, modern-day slavery, that's very real today. Very real. Countries that are experimenting with nuclear powers are very real. The last decade has also seen nature at its worst. Earthquakes in various places, various magnitudes, and tsunamis. Those have been really very powerful displays of nature. The one in Japan was just really breathtaking, to see the footage. Those waves crashing into land, going as far as they did into land, sweeping everything out that they did. Very, very scary. The economy as well. It has the world, in a sense, holding its breath. So the world, really, if you look around it can be a pretty scary place. Abraham lived in pretty scary times. He was a traveler. He was a sojourner, traveling through other people's lands and kingdoms, accumulating wealth and possessions. When he was traveling through Egypt, he feared for his own life because of how lovely his wife Sarah and how wicked the Pharaoh king of Egypt was. Okay, he wasn't wrong. he wasn't wrong about what he figured that in a wicked place, a place without God, what they would be like. He was right. As soon as he got there, they saw how beautiful Sarah was, and Pharaoh basically said, I want her. And Abraham just did the, okay, she's all yours, man. Abraham knew if he would have said no, he could have been killed. He could have been killed just for refusing Pharaoh's demands. Marauders and bandits were always an issue for everyone, especially for Abraham, because he didn't have a city to defend himself. He lived in tents. He traveled. I mean, a city wall is a lot more protection than a tent. Okay, swords and arrows can go through a tent quicker than they can through a city wall. Abraham didn't have the means to defend himself in that sort of way. But Abraham had one sure foundation. He had the call and the promises of God. We remember that it was the call of God that has him where he was at. And it's not his own whims, okay? It's not his own smartness. It's not his own ability. It's the call of God that has him there. Had God not called him by grace, Abraham would still be Abram, living in Haran and worshiping idols, and he would still be childless. But now God has just promised Abraham and Sarah that in 1 year they will hear the pitter-patter of little feet in their tent as Sarah will give birth to a son, Abraham's true heir. The Lord himself has appeared to Abraham to tell him here in Genesis 18. And so basically this is kind of like Abraham is getting to that peak point where you can kind of say, finally, after 25 years of waiting, the true heir of Abraham is coming forth. Finally, yes. Okay, he's got a year to go. Abraham is no doubt, he's excited, and Sarah is perplexed. Okay, when she heard the men talking with Abraham, and he said, and the men said, in a year you're going to have a kid. Apparently Sarah's listening behind the tent, and when she hears it, she lets out a little snicker. She does that sort of thing, and the account is actually kind of funny because the men hear her, and they're like, "Oh, so you're laughing?" And she denies it. She's like, "No, I wasn't laughing." I kind of imagine the face of the little kids when I ask them, "Did you do what they said you did?" No, not me, sir. No, I can imagine her already with that sort of face denying it, but. So she has her little laugh. Now, as the conversation comes to an end, the Lord and the two men, they turn toward Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we've already heard about Sodom and Gomorrah before this. If you remember from the last week's sermon, Lot, he had moved into Sodom and Gomorrah. He had moved in there, and Abraham actually went to war to help out the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. He went to go help them so that he could rescue his nephew Lot. So these are not cities that are not unfamiliar. But these cities, they've been notorious for their wickedness and evil. They're violent cities. They're cities corrupted by their sexual ethics as well. God has come to judge these cities. But God does something very interesting. He invites Abraham into his own council. He invites Abraham essentially to act as a priest on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah in this account. He asks him to basically to be their defense attorney. So it's a really interesting account. Three things come out of this text. First, God, as a just judge, he must judge. So that's our first point. Then we see Abraham's invitation to intercede. And then thirdly, we'll see why Abraham stops at 10, but why we can go on to 1. So let's start first of all with divine judgment. Divine judgment is never an easy topic. Okay, it's never easy talking about the wrath of God. It's never easy talking about hell. Okay, even as Christians, even if we believe in it, it's not an easy topic by any means. Talking about the existence of evil and suffering in the world is also not an easy topic. Nonetheless, our text reveals to us the reality of divine judgment. But we also get a glimpse. We get a glimpse into the heart of the divine judge himself. As God turns his face toward Sodom and Gomorrah, he says this. He says, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. Now, the sin of these two cities has been continually before God, apparently for some time. That's the sense of what the text gives us. That this is not a one-time offense why God is coming to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. It's been a continual outpouring of sinfulness and a continual oppression of people by the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, notice this is something on text. It says God says, I'm going to go down to see. Why does it say I will go down to see what they have done? I mean, he's God, right? Doesn't he already know? Isn't he already aware of what's going on here? And of course, God already knows. But God coming down is revealing to us God as condescended. That is, God taking upon himself what we've called before. We've called them covenantal properties, to say that he wants to have true interaction with us. God is not a God. Even as a judge, he's not staying far away when he's doing his judging. He comes down and he really does interact with us. He wants us to see, and he wants Abraham to see, that his judgment also is not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary. Again, this is not a one-time offense where God is just, all of a sudden he's upset, for one little thing, for one little act. It's not arbitrary, and God wants us to see that. It's not spontaneous, and it's not out of nowhere. Rather, God has a good case against Sodom and Gomorrah. He has heard their outcry. In the Bible, this is a word that is usually used of the oppressed in the Bible. The outcry of the oppressed. One of their sins is revealed in the next chapters. They want to commit, basically, homosexual rape with the two travelers who they don't know are God's angels. Now, I assure you, that was not the first time that they had done that. That was not their first time. Lot, apparently, he appears to know about the practice, which is why he encourages the two angels to stay with him and not in the town square. That's why he was, guys, you got to come in with me. And the angels, they probably already knew what was going on. Like, no, we're going to stay here. And Lot's like, guys, you really want to stay in my house tonight. And so he was urging them. Why was he urging them? Because he knew. He knew the sins of the city. He knew what that city was all about. He knew about the wickedness in it. There were probably other victims, other travelers who had suffered that crime, who had suffered that atrocity. I really, the words escape me right now to say it, but they had suffered under that. God's justice has been stirred. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 through 50, it says a little bit more about Sodom. It says this, it says, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me. So I removed them when I saw it." So they had a pretty good list of sins, apparently, that God is actually bringing against them. It's not just one particular sin, and a lot of people, in more conservative circles, they'll say that their only sin was this idea of homosexual rape. It didn't start there. They had pride, and these are things where we can see that we're the same as Sodom and Gomorrah in that way. We live in a land that does have a lot. And look at one of the things that Sodom was judged for not helping the poor. And that says something to everybody. That says something to everybody. And God says, so I removed them when I saw it. So we must observe, one, that God, as a just judge, he makes a case, and he has come down to deliver his judgment. His judgments are not random and the roll of cosmic dice, as a lot of people like to accuse. God has heard the cries of the victims. He's heard the cries of the families of the victims, and he has come down. So, from there we move that the just judge, he must judge. He must judge. No judge would be worth his pay if he kept passing along his cases to lower courts or refuse to make a judgment. Now, maybe, you might say that, well, you don't believe in a judging God, but rather in a merciful or a loving God only. But when you really listen to what's going on here, there's people here that are being oppressed. There's people here that are genuinely enduring suffering at the hands of other people. People are being victimized. They're being treated unjustly. God wouldn't be merciful if he just let Sodom off the hook and forgot those who have been ill-treated. If he forgot those who had been abused. If he had forgotten those who had been raped. If he had forgotten those who had suffered unjustly at the hands of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That would make God a cruel God if he just let those sins go. That would make him a cruel God. I mean, could you imagine? Could you imagine a court not wanting to hear a case for sexual assault, let's say? What if they just didn't want to hear your case? Maybe a victim, they've undergone a rape or again a sexual assault of some sort, and it comes to the court, and the judge says, "Well, I really don't want to, devote that much time. I've got other cases, more important cases, federal higher cases that I've got to listen to." You think about that. How would you feel if that was you? You would feel oppressed. You'd feel oppressed, and then what would your feelings be toward that judge? That judge, why is he a judge again if he doesn't want to judge? He's not functioning like he's supposed to. Think about the Trayvon Martin case in Florida. We had a whole nation crying out for justice. A judge who will not judge is unjust, to say the least, and probably a coward or cruel, to say the most. Justice is never served without a judge who will not judge. Justice is never served without a judge who will not judge. And so we see here, God is not passing the buck. He's not passing the buck. He comes to judge. Indeed, he must judge. He's the only one who can judge in this case. I mean, you think about it, especially in this time. Do you think these people that have suffered at the hands of Sodom and Gomorrah are going to appeal to the first federal court of Sodom and Gomorrah and say, "Hey, we'd like to press charges against you all"? Probably not, because I'll bet the judge, there was probably one of the oppressors as well. Who are they going to appeal to? Are they going to appeal to the next kingdom? And the next kingdom is going to go, "What? That's your problem. You were in their town. We can't help you." Who are they going to pass it to? God is the only one who can judge here. God is the only one who can judge. In their own eyes, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, I mean, they for all practical purposes for them, they haven't done anything wrong. That's their natural practice. Apparently they do that thing a lot. God has to judge them. God must judge sin. So, while many people object to the thought of divine judgment, in our heart of hearts, we always cry out for it whenever we have been wronged. We always cry out for justice whenever we've been wronged. If you're still of the mindset that you think divine judgment is an outdated sort of idea, it's outmoded, maybe that was too mythological, and we've advanced or in our thinking of God of some sort, all you can pretty much say is wait till it's your family. Wait till it's your son. Wait till it's your daughter. Wait till it's you. Wait till it's you that's been a victim of gang violence here. Wait till it's you that's been beaten because some kid has got to get into a gang and his initiation is to go and take your vehicle at whatever cost. You wait till it's you, and all of a sudden, when the outcry is yours, suddenly divine justice begins to really make practical sense. This is part of what it means that God has come down, is that God identifies himself with the people who are crying out. He identifies himself with the oppressed. He enters into our world. He enters into our suffering. And he knows what it is that we're going through. He knows what it is that these victims of Sodom and Gomorrah, what they've gone through. So, as the men leave, they head towards Sodom and Gomorrah to carry out God's judgment. No doubt Abraham, he's probably worried for his nephew Lot. That's got to be the big thing on his mind, because he's taken up residence in Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible says, so the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham, as it were, is invited by God to take up the defense attorney position as he begins his plea with God. God invites Abraham into God's counsel. This is a really neat thing. It's a really neat thing. It's a very privileged position, because, it's like, okay, you've got this judge of all the earth, and Abraham, he comes to acknowledge that. He's inviting Abraham to make a plea, but the judge, there's a sense in which the judge already knows the verdict. The judge already knows that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah are guilty. So it's kind of interesting, in a sense, like, Abraham, stick around for a bit. I want you to understand something about me, is essentially what he's saying. So when it says that Abraham drew near, the word that's translated drew near here is often used for someone about to deliver a legal plea. You'll also recognize the word drew near if you've read through like Leviticus or Exodus, when a priest would draw near to God to worship. Okay, when they would offer the sacrifice, that is, they would come in a sense present the animal that was considered to take away to take upon itself all the guilt of Israel, and it was condemned, and so it was killed. And then the scapegoat was sent out. That was a legal exchange that happened in the temple. So the words that mark his opening statement, we note here one, okay, that Abraham has no problems with God's justice. Okay, Abraham, he doesn't have any problems with God's justice. He has no problem with God, basically the way it says it here, sweeping away the wicked. Okay, he has no problems with that. He has no problems with God's law. That is to say, he acknowledges that the guilty party, that there is a guilty party whom he calls the wicked. Abraham knows what Sodom is like. If you remember from Genesis 14, Abraham went to war to help Sodom and Gomorrah because they were taken captive by other kings. Okay, Abraham, he knows what these people are like. He's not ignorant. Okay, so Abraham, the defense attorney, he begins by presupposing God's law and the guilt of Sodom. But Abraham, he also notes a principle that we often see in the world, though we as individualistic modern Americans don't use very much, but yet we see it at work. Okay, and that is this principle that the actions of the few often have consequences for the many. The consequence or the actions of the few have consequences for the many. Now, how can this be? Okay, again, in our individualistic way of thinking, we might think that that's unfair. The acts of one person can lead to the destruction of many. We in our individualistic and Western culture, we tend to find this pretty offensive today. Why should, and here's the big one for Christianity, why should Adam's sin be counted as mine? Why should somebody sin who existed? I didn't even know the guy. Okay, why should what he did be imputed to me? Why is that counted as my sin too? Is God fair when he does that? I wasn't there. I didn't do it. It's not fair that God condemns millions and billions of people because of the act of one man. That's how the objection to Christianity often goes sometimes. There's the account in Joshua 7 in which Achan, if you guys remember that, when Joshua and he leads the armies and they go to war, and they're commanded not to take any of the spoils of war. And Achan, he ends up keeping a couple of little things, hides them in his tent, and when they go to battle again, they lose the battle. And Jacob's like, Joshua, he gets all like, no, Lord, I can't believe you brought us here to, to be defeated, and why did you bring us out? And God kind of does Joshua, shush, you lost because somebody has a devoted thing or an idol in the tent, and it's in the camp somewhere. Okay, and Joshua's like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense now, and then they go looking for to see who has it, and it turns out they find out that it's Achan, and so when they confront Achan about it, they tell him, give glory to the Lord, and he fesses up, and guess what? They don't just kill Achan, they kill Achan's whole family. They kill Achan's whole family. This principle is called corporate solidarity. Okay, that's the fancy term for it. Corporate solidarity, in which basically a representative stands in the place of the many. So the idea is that as the representative goes, so goes the rest. It's not a principle that we in the West don't understand because of our individualistic thinking. That is, it's not something that we can't grasp. We just don't like to think this way very much. But it's here. It's here. We still see it here and there. Much of the world culture still operate in this way of thinking. For instance, Muslims of today will still hold Christians of today accountable for the actions of Christians in the Crusades. Were you in the Crusades? Anybody here in the Crusades? No, but Muslims of today who also were not in the Crusades still hold Christians today guilty of the actions of Christians in the past. They still do that. They still impute that to us. We didn't do it, but there's still, in a sense, there's this level of accountability there. Even here in the West, there are still hints of this corporate way of thinking when it comes to racism. when it comes to racism. This is still here, in which people in the present will hold races corporately accountable for sins committed against their ancestors. That's a very real thing, and it can go straight across all races. All races, have this sort of thinking someplace. Individual responsibility is certainly true. Okay, so we're not denying that, and the Bible's not denying that. But our actions, usually, they do not affect just us. They affect others for them or against them as well. Take a divorce, for instance. Okay, perhaps one or more of the spouses is personally at fault, but the effects trickle down to the rest of the families as well. They trickle down to the children. Did the children do it? Are the children at fault? No. But do they suffer still for the actions of one? Yeah. Entire families can suffer for the result of the actions of the few can have consequences for the many. Recently, here's another one. Penn State coach Jerry Sandusky was tried for abusing children, but not only society didn't only hold him guilty, they held the entire coaching staff guilty. And there's a sense they've held that entire university guilty. They've attributed the actions of one or the few to have consequences for the many. So there's this balance in a sense of corporate responsibility and individual responsibility. We can't shake that off. Okay, as much as we don't apply it consistently, it's still there in our thinking. It's still there. We need to keep that principle in mind, because basically this principle is the key to understanding much of the Bible and how God deals with his people. In fact, it's basically it's the principle upon which the concept of the priesthood that Abraham is functioning in right now is based upon. In one sense, the way this is going to play out is as the priest goes, so are going to go the people. And you'll see that later in the Levitical system, the priesthood system. As the priest goes, so go the people. If the priest doesn't offer correct atonement, if he doesn't offer sufficient atonement, then the entire people are not atoned for. You could have the entire nation, in a sense, bring their proper sacrifices, but if the priest gets it wrong, none of what the people did will count. Only what the priest did will count for the rest of the people. That's what happens on the Day of Atonement. So, that's what Abraham is. He's going to start to work in here, okay? That one can stand before God representing the many that he serves. In this case, God would hold the group responsible for the sins of some. Now, Abraham continues his plea, and so here's where he kind of starts to make his little case. He says, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose that there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" Now, the word that Abraham is using for righteous here, that has legal tones and not just moral tones, okay? That is, Abraham is asking if God will, for the sake of those who are not guilty, will spare the guilty. So in a sense, Abraham kind of recognized that, probably not every single person in Sodom and Gomorrah has actually participated in the pride, in the greed, in not aiding the poor, and in all the others, the sexual immorality that's going on. It's very possible. And so Abraham is going to start to argue that there are some people who are not guilty of doing those things. He's basically, he's asking God. One, he's asking him not to lay down his standard of justice, okay, and this is important because Abraham is still saying, God, I know you're just, and if they deserve it, they deserve it. Okay, so he's not telling God, lay down your standard of justice. He's asking God, and this is really neat because this is what speaks the loudest about God here. He says he's basically asking God if God will honor righteousness so much that the righteousness of a few can save the guilty. God, do you love righteousness so much that you're willing to look more at the righteousness of the people who are in there, and can that outdo the wickedness of the people that are in the city? Now, older commentators have pointed out that what Abraham is doing here is absolutely remarkable. While listening to Tim Keller on this passage. There we go. There's the Tim Keller message. Okay, he said this. He said that what Abraham is doing here is he's engaging in a deep theological exercise with God. He said, you see, Abraham knows the principle of corporate solidarity. He knows that it works in such a way that the sins of a few can affect the many. Okay, that's pretty much standard. All right, but says Abraham, and this is the way Keller put it. He says, "I wonder, Lord, can that principle work in reverse? Could you so honor the righteousness of the few that it would spare the many?" That in that time that was unheard of. It was it was something that no other religion held to. I mean, it was pretty much you sin and you deserve wrath. You deserve judgment. That's pretty much what was around at that time. And so we look at it this way, in a sense, if it's true, okay, or if it's only true that the sins of one or the few can condemn the many, then ask yourself personally, what hope can we personally stand on? If all it takes is the right person to sin, whoever it is that represents us, whether it's your boss at work, he stands for who you are in a sense in your career. It's your parents, they stand for who you are, in your family life, in your social life. If it's the city that you represent and your mayor messes up, there's a sense in which somebody's always representing us in some sort of way. And if it's only the case that the sins of these representatives, if those are the only things that we have to stand on, in a sense, what hope do we have? What hope do we have? What then can we stand on? None of us here, when we're born, we're not all new Adams, okay? We're not born sinless. We're not born spotless. We're not born uncondemned until we commit our first sin. Okay, we come out of the womb already with a sinful nature. We come out of the womb already with it. Psalm 58:3, the wicked come forth speaking lies right out of the womb. They're already there. Anybody here messed with kids enough? Manipulation is it's something that comes natural. You don't have to teach a child how to manipulate. You don't have to teach a child how to be selfish. It's natural. It's there. It's there. We, in a sense, we inherit the sins of others in one way or another. In a sense, in Adam, we inherit his guilt in a legal sort of way, but we also inherit sins by examples. The examples of our parents, the examples of our family, the examples that we see on TV. Somewhere we're inheriting somebody else's sins. Kids follow in the sins of their parents. If the parents were abusive, the child also grows up to be abusive in some ways, and he'll be abusive to others later. We inherit people's sins when they sin against us. If we've ever been victims of hate or abuse or some form of persecution or oppression, bullying is a big thing nowadays, we'll usually turn around and we'll harden ourselves, sometimes to the point of committing great atrocities as a way of paying people back because of the abuse against us. But if the principle of corporate solidarity only works to condemn, we're really out of luck. There's no hope. If it only works that way, there's no hope. If we can only stand on the record of ourselves as sinners, or the record of those sinners who have gone before us, what hope do we have? This would mean basically that we had one shot at supreme happiness, that we had one shot at salvation, and somebody already blew it for us, and our own sins are just proof that that person did. That's a pretty dim view of life. That's a pretty dim view of life. It's very bleak. It's very hopeless. There isn't any light at the end of the tunnel if the tunnel hasn't already collapsed and there's no daylight in there at all. Abraham's question begins to probe God to see if it could work the other way. Abraham's looking for hope here. He's looking for hope. He's looking for mercy from this just judge. So instead of being condemned by the representation of the wrong people, could God spare, which is the same Hebrew word for forgive, the many because of the record of the right people? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. That is remarkable. God admits, yes, he will. God will be merciful, but it's not because he's laying down his law. It's just that he's looking at the righteousness of the few that will cover up, or as the Hebrew word here, or that will forgive the sins of the many. God will not lay aside his justice, but he will so honor, and he so loves righteousness that he says, yes, Abraham, yes, I will do that. And Abraham, you should read the text that he's kind of hesitant. He's kind of scared that he's talking to God the judge. Okay, he's kind of hesitant, and that's why you kind of get this whole, Lord, who am I, to ask you? Who am I to come into your presence? But what about for 45? And there's almost a sense in which Abraham's like, expecting him, he's expecting God to just strike him down for kind of being so bold. He was already bold to ask for 50. In a sense, he was already bold to ask for 50. So when he kind of does, I almost picture him out, when he says 45, he almost ducks and just waits for him, and the Lord's standing there right next to him, when they're conversing. And I almost, for me at least, I can picture God just kind of calmly saying, or looking maybe at Abraham like, yeah, Abraham, I will, in a very gentle kind of way. And Abraham, he's kind of building up courage. So as God, agrees, and then he says, again, forgive me, Lord, 40? Yes, Abraham, 40. Oh, wow. Gets a little courage up, and then 30. Yes, 30. 20? Yes, Abraham, for 20. 10? Yes, Abraham, I will do it for 10. Tim Keller says this. He says, so predominant is the will of God to save sinners that he will accept the righteousness of others on their behalf. The judge will not lay aside righteousness to save the wicked, but he will save the wicked for the sake of the righteousness of others. That is outstanding. That is very gracious. That is very merciful. Every other god of every other religion that asks you to appear before their God on the basis, they ask you to come on the basis of your own record. And here God, the great judge of all the earth, is basically telling Abraham, he's revealing to Abraham and to us, he's saying, I'll let you stand on the record of somebody else. I will let you stand on the record of somebody else. The God of the Bible, he alone is willing to save with the record of someone else's righteous record on your behalf. Now, Abraham, as a high priest here, he's really stumbled on to a really remarkable truth about God as judge. Okay, again, God will not curb his justice for anybody. He cannot lay that aside. He cannot deny who he is. He cannot deny what he is. He is just. Justice is not some attribute that exists separate and apart from him. It is part of the essential makeup of his being. The children of Israel, as they're reading this, in a sense, as they're learning this, coming out of Egypt, would have known that even they were not immune to the justice of God if they acted corruptly. Even, Abraham, he's really fearing for Lot here. And so there's a sense in which God is also telling Abraham, I'm not curbing my justice. Even if it's your own nephew, Lot, I'm not going to curb my justice. So if Lot's going to be saved, he's going to have to be saved on the basis of the righteousness of somebody else. But I'm not going to drop my standard just because he's related to you, Abraham. I will not drop my standard. But I will honor righteousness so much that I can save on somebody else's righteousness. So the Israelites would have basically needed to learn here that God's justice is not to be trifled with. And that's why Abraham, he's so cautious in approaching God here. He's approaching a God who cannot and will not curb his justice. And the priests, you think about it, every time that they went into the temple to make that sacrifice, they were scared that if they went in there and if they sinned in there, they were in the Holy of Holies. There were provisions made, within the law. If they dropped dead, they had bells, they had a rope tied to them so they could drag them out. The priest was scared every time that he went into the Holy of Holies. He was scared. Abraham is basically displaying that fear here too. Abraham, he's walking on eggshells, just talking to the judge. But though God will not curb his justice, again, he's willing to save on the righteousness of others. This is a really huge theological breakthrough, especially, and you see it so early in the Old Testament. This is something, in one sense we think, oh, this is just New Testament stuff. No, it's already right here. It's already right here. And if you can already see it, we're already seeing Christ in here and how Christ even saves us. I'll get to that in just a bit. But Abraham's priestly prayer, it stops. He's had one of the biggest theological breakthroughs, one of the greatest understandings of grace, one of the greatest visions of God, not only as a just judge, but as a merciful judge. And he stops. He stops. In a sense, Abraham as the high priest here, there's a sense in which, Abraham fails as a high priest. Abraham failed. His high priestly prayer, his intercession, on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, it didn't quite cut it. It didn't go far enough. Abraham, it's funny because he just kind of stops. After he asked about the 10 righteous, and God said, yes, for the sake of 10, I will spare the city. The Bible just says this. It's very kind of very brief, very abrupt. It just says, and the Lord went his way, and when he finished speaking to Abraham, Abraham returned to his place. It's like, that's it. Will you say for 10? Yes, I'll say for 10. Abraham just walks away. The Lord goes his own way. That was the end of it. Now, several explanations have been offered here. According to some commentators, 10 is the minimum amount of people needed to have a legitimate community. Commentators have gone on to say here that since Lot and his family were not 10, apparently they were only 8, that Abraham knew this, and so Abraham ceased his inquiry. That is, Abraham figured that there wasn't enough righteous in Sodom. Now, that may have some merit as far as that explanation goes, but it is more likely that as Abraham was working his way to the number that we're all left waiting for, what's that number? Wow, we're waiting for 1. We want him to go to 1. We're in a sense, it's cliffhanger. He gets to 10, and it's like, oh, he's going to get to 5, then he's going to get to 1, and it's like 10, and then he walks away, and it's like, dude, why did you stop? Why did you stop? It's more likely that as Abraham was working his way to the number that we were all left waiting for, Abraham knew that there was no one righteous in the city. Even Lot, his own nephew, was not righteous before God. Lot was living in Sodom. He was sharing in the wealth of the city. Remember also, why did Lot separate from Abraham in Genesis 14? Because he had grown wealthy with Abraham, and now he needed more room. Remember, they were fighting amongst themselves. They had grown so large. Abraham's cattle and the cattle of Lot, the flocks, the shepherds were fighting amongst themselves. And so when Abraham gave him the option, pick the best land that you want, and what did Lot choose? He went to what he believed was the most fertile of land, where he could get richer, where he could grow, where he could grow even more wealthy. And he chose Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot has his own idolatry issues. He's got his own issues of why he made the choice that he did. He didn't choose where he wanted to live because of anything righteous in him. I think this is why Abraham couldn't go to 1, and he leaves the whole Old Testament hanging, as it were. In a sense, it's like those old Batman shows. They get you right where the climax, and then bam, tune in next week, same bat time, bat channel. You mean I got to come back? And what if I'm at work and blah blah. So he stops. And there's a sense, really, the whole Old Testament really does come to a halt right there. Because you stop, and the principle is laid out. It's laid out. Yes, God will save on the righteousness of others. Okay, 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Uh-oh. Stops. It stops. And you read the whole Old Testament, and you don't find those 10 people. You don't find 10. Really, you read the whole Old Testament, you don't even find the 1. You don't find the 1. You can look at the best heroes of the Old Testament. I mean, name somebody. Jacob, Joseph, who? David. Do I need to say anything? Moses, murderer, one there talking back to God, gets upset. Here's the rock. There's your water people. You name it, they have a flaw. The best of the saints in the Old Testament, they still have a flaw. We can't even find the one. There's still, the principles laid out, but it's like, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? Centuries later, the right one would come along. Jesus Christ, the right high priest, whose intercession would not fail, the righteous one whose record would save the many. You see, in Jesus, when he offered his high priestly prayer to God, he didn't fail. Jesus' prayer didn't fail. The book of Hebrews reminds us that Jesus' intercession never fails. It says in Hebrews 7:25 that he is able to save to the uttermost, completely, those who come to God through him. Abraham, he may have prayed for a people who could have hurt him, but Jesus Christ on the cross, he prayed for a people who were killing him. Abraham stood at a distance on his prayer. Christ stood right there and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Abraham only risked his own life by speaking to God in the bold manner that he did, but Jesus Christ gave his life to gain the audience with God. Abraham inquired and he discovered the principle that the righteousness of some could save the many. But on the cross, Jesus Christ, the righteous one, was giving his own righteous life to save others. Abraham stopped at 10. Indeed, the whole Old Testament, again, it leaves us hanging. Whose righteousness can I cling to? As you continue to go through the Old Testament, everybody, prophet, priest, kings, the corporate leaders of every single community, they fail. Every single one of them. The prophets, some of them were prophesying lies. Even they weren't pure. Isaiah, if you read the first 5 chapters of Isaiah and then you get to chapter 6, it's in chapter 6 that he kind of has his meeting with God. And so that kind of, it almost says that as eloquent as he was in chapters 1 through 5, he confessed himself in chapter 6 finally to be a man of unclean lips. When he says that, he was basically admitting, I was using my speech as my righteousness. My oratory skills were what I was using to cling to and be acceptable before God. And it's not until he met God face to face in the temple that he confessed that his speech was his sin. That was his righteousness. That's what he was clinging to. And he confessed himself as a man of unclean lips, dwelling among a people of unclean lips. Jesus is the one, not in the Matrix sort of way, but Jesus is the one in a sense that's silently mentioned here in Genesis 18. In Jesus, the gospel is this. In Jesus, the tension of the narrative here in Genesis 18 is removed. And the gospel is basically this, that our sins have us utterly guilty and corrupted before God. We are utterly flawed. We are utterly ruined and utterly without hope. But in Jesus, we are utterly righteous. We are utterly forgiven. And we are utterly accepted by the judge. That is the gospel. That is the gospel that is presented here. That we are spared for the sake of the righteousness of someone else, namely Jesus Christ. He fulfilled the righteous requirements of the law so that God, as a just judge, he still saw the demands of the law met. God didn't send Jesus so that he could just be, in a sense, live however he wanted, do his own thing. No, Jesus came to do what we should have done. He came to live how we should have lived. And in that sense, he served justice. He fulfilled the entire law. Even his death was Jesus Christ fulfilling the demands of the law. Even his death. And now when we believe in Christ, when we believe in Jesus, when we plead before the judge of all the earth with Jesus' righteousness, the question, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right, is not a scary one for us. But now, because we know that God so honors the righteousness of his own Son, the right thing that the just judge does there is honor the righteousness of his Son upon those who believe in his Son. And he says to us, not guilty, righteous. And that's how we can stand before God in the righteousness of his Son. For Abraham, it was scary when God came down to judge because God's case was rock solid. God knows all the sins that are committed against him. There's no bargaining with the judge of all the earth. When Abraham asked rhetorically, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right, he was not saying that God won't. Okay, he wasn't questioning God in that way. Rather, he was acknowledging that God always does justice and cannot do otherwise. That justice involves the guilt of our own sin, and Abraham knew that there was no way to get away from God's justice. His only hope, and the only hope for those whom God directs his justice toward, is the righteousness of another. In Adam, in ourselves, we stand in a head-on collision with this judge. How would you face the judge? How would I face the judge? Because he has to judge. He has to judge. If we look at our lives, I mean, it's not like the whole world has only sinned against us. We've also sinned against it. We've also sinned against it, and we can think of people in our past that we've wronged. We can think of people that we hurt. And God looks at that and says, you've got to pay for that. That has to be judged. As a just judge, God cannot let that pain, that suffering, that injustice, he cannot let that go for anybody. The only hope, the way to walk away from encountering God's justice, is to stand on the righteousness of the righteous one, Jesus Christ. He is the only one whose record is big enough for more than himself. In him we can boldly look to the judge and plead for forgiveness and say, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And we can know that it will lead to our forgiveness because Jesus has paid the penalty in full. He has given us his righteousness, and the judge must honor it. Amen.